In this lecture, we're going to be talking about ethical principles that show up in research. And we're going to be looking at research as a broad category and then narrowing it down to research in agriculture. And so, the reason that we need to be talking about ethics and the reason that I've moved it to the beginning of the semester is because by the time we get to the end of the semester where I had normally done this lecture, we are burnt out in dealing with finals and a final project, and I'm not sure that it resonates. And so it's become apparent that through the COVID-19 issues, that ethics in research is more important now than it has ever been. And so the reason that I want to spend some time talking about ethical procedures in research is because we have really had to learn through poor examples of what constitutes ethical versus non ethical research. And so the classic example that has kind of dictated this really hit the presses in 1998, where Andrew Wakefield, who was a professor in Great Britain, had a paper published in The Lancet, which is a European scientific peer reviewed journal that has a really extremely high impact factor, like probably the highest in the world. And so an impact factor is going to be a rating for a certain scientific journal. So it takes into account a bunch of different things. There's a whole algorithm that goes into it, but basically, some of the big things are how many times the paper is viewed and how many times it is cited. And so here in the US, our biggest journal is Nature. And so it's very prestigious to be able to publish an article in Nature. So, and you can see that the impact factor of the Lancet today is even higher than Nature. And just to give you some relevance, our major ag journals that we use quite often are like Agronomy, and that impact factor is 1.8, and the Journal of Animal Science, which I serve on the editorial board for, and that impact factor is 1.69. It actually just went up a little bit, but so that I just wanted to give you some background on what impact factors were relative to the prestige of the journal that a scientist publishes in, because the Lancet in Great Britain was a really prestigious journal that actually has a very rigorous peer review process. And in 1998, Andrew Wakefield had published a journal article that basically stated that vaccinations were linked and caused autism. And what we found out a couple years later is that he falsified a bunch of his data. And so even the intensive peer review process didn't catch this falsification during that review process. But luckily, outside scientists that started questioning his methodology after the paper was published really saw holes in his data. And so they called for a couple other reviews, and eventually the truth came out that a lot of that data was falsified. And so the paper ended up being retracted, but the damage had already been done, and we're still dealing with that today. So there's still a lot of controversy out there. It's actually fueled the no vaccination movement, and because there's this fear out there that vaccinations, routine vaccination for things like measles and rubella and those type of things, cause autism. And it was, unfortunately, that was based on false data. And so this is why ethics in research is really, really important. This because if you falsify scientific data, it has the potential to snowball and change policy, and also change public perception of what we should be doing. And so the reason that I want to spend some time talking about this is because with the COVID-19 issue, this is still becoming it's more important than ever now to talk about ethical procedures in research. And the reason for this is because we're in a era of scientific distrust. So the general public doesn't even trust science. They trust their friend on Facebook who is a non scientific authority over a peer reviewed journal publication. And so that is a major concern and should be a major concern to you as a scientist. And so there was some interesting data that came out in 2017 that said that only about a quarter of social media users trust the science posts that they see on social media. So, and those are legitimate scientific posts, like from a peer-reviewed journal article. So only 25% of people actually trust them. And so I really hope that your stomachs are clenching right now, because one of my personal values is science and scientific authority. That's why I'm in the job that I'm in. And so when people distrust the scientific process and the scientific method, that's a hard stop for me. I am not sure how to handle that. So I just wanted to bring that up in this class at the beginning, because we're going to see different areas where ethics can actually infiltrate the scientific method and the experimental process. So in terms of like big ethical dilemmas, we've seen the research process evolve over time to encompass different ethical principles, but that evolutionary process has unfortunately been at the cost of poor examples and poor choices. And a lot of this is because we didn't know, right? So, when we are looking at scientific research in the 30s, in the middle of the Great Depression, through World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, etc., it was just a different time. And so one of the classic case studies is this Tuskegee experiment that really started to set precedents about ethical research projects that were taking place. And so this study was a long-term study where American researchers actually withheld treatment from African American people that had syphilis. And the sole purpose of withholding treatment was to study the long-term effects of the disease. And so their thought process was coming from a very scientific place and wanting to seek truth and long-term effects. But the way that they did that wasn't necessarily what some people would call ethical. So this is a good opportunity for us to just pause for just a second and think about this process. So was this ethical? And then try to think through why you think this may have been ethical or not ethical. All right. A second case study was the Willowbrook Study in the 60s that really set precedents for ethical scientific experimentation, where children that had developmental disabilities were deliberately infected with hepatitis. And the way that they were infected, or some of them were infected, was they had to ingest fecal matter to contract hepatitis. The purpose of the study was to examine the course of the disease and to test a potential immunization. So they were creating scientific models to test a vaccination. So in the same format as we just did, let's take a few seconds and run this through your ethical filter and work through, was this ethical or was this not ethical? All right. We also see ethical procedures and turning points show up in different areas of the research process. So this is a really quick case study about the credit given to a scientist. So we'll just read through this really quickly together. Ben, a third-year graduate student, had been working on a research project that involved an important new experimental technique. For a national meeting in his discipline, Ben wrote an abstract and gave a brief presentation that mentioned the new technique. After his presentation, he was surprised and pleased when Dr. Freeman, a leading researcher from another university, engaged him in an extended conversation. Dr. Freeman asked Ben extensively about the new technique, and Ben described it fully. Ben's own faculty advisor often encouraged his students not to keep secrets from other researchers, and Ben was flattered that Dr. Freeman would be so interested in his work. 6 months later, Ben was leafing through a journal when he noticed an article by Dr. Freeman. The article described an experiment that clearly depended on the technique that Ben had developed. He didn't mind. In fact, he was again somewhat flattered that his technique had so strongly influenced Dr. Freeman's work. But when he turned to the citations expecting to see a reference to his abstract or presentation, his name was nowhere to be found. And so this was an actual example that did happen that was published in an ethics paper by PANS in 1995. And so some things to think through here. What are Ben's options? What should Ben do and why? And then what should Ben's faculty advisor do? And so these are different areas of the research process where ethics can come up. There's 1,000 more areas, but keep in mind that we as individual researchers and scientists actually filter certain scenarios and situations through different filters, like our values, our morals, our experiences, and sometimes even our politics. So it's very much like the Ben Franklin glasses that Nicolas Cage found in National Treasure. And so we need ethical people in research for 4 main reasons. First of all, to promote truth and minimize error. Okay, so the scientific process is always been about finding truth. Okay, we also need ethical people in research to have really fair and essential collaborations that can move research endeavors forward. There needs to be accountability to the general public so that we don't see a huge distrust in science like we're seeing now. And there needs to be a continuance of public support for research. And this is really important because public support for research comes through tax dollars. And so when you pay taxes, a portion of that goes to the federal government, and a portion of that gets divvied out into dollars for like USDA, the National Institute of Health, etc., that serves as kind of third-party funding agencies so that people in public institutions can do research. And that's important because people in public institutions like us here at Chico State or at other universities are not doing research for profit. And that's the big difference between like us and a private company like Zoetis or Mariel or Simplot. Okay, so those companies still do research and we need them. They actually drive the scientific process forward, but they need to also work with the third-party verification agencies like universities to make sure that there's no corruption or bias happening in their research project. So these are the 4 main reasons why we need good people in research, and the list really goes on. And so we need to keep pushing for ethical procedures and have ethical people in research so we don't regress and go back to a caveman era. And this pun is completely intended. You're going to understand it in about 8 weeks. And so we need to be able to feed 9.8 billion people by the year 2050. And so to do that, we're going to have to do research to figure out the best, most efficient ways to produce more food using less land and resources. And there's a million other reasons out there too. You could literally insert your answer to this list as well. And so when we look at the principles of research ethics, there's a lot of different areas where ethical consideration has to show up. Everywhere from objectivity to responsible publication to animal care, which we're going to discuss in the next segment. And so research can show up in agriculture in a lot of different areas. Okay, so we can see really poor attempts at gathering literature before a research project starts. That's an ethical issue. We can see simple things like improper or negligent labeling of a sample being ran in the lab, and that value for whatever trait is being measured being entered into the treatment that it was not officially a part of. And so some of those things are done by mistake, but this is why we're going to drill into you things like proper labeling and integrity and data collection. We can see ethics show up when people get lazy and don't thoroughly collect data with the highest integrity possible. And we can see incorrect analyses actually be conducted for the wrong experimental design. And then we also see major issues show up with things like animal care and welfare considerations. And we're going to talk more about that here in just a second. And so I wanted to share with you really quickly a thing that still brings me a lot of shame and a lot of guilt. When I was in high school, one of my first jobs was working for the cooperative extension agent in our county. And there was one project that I was collecting data on. It was actually a peppermint study. And so in our area, peppermint was a really big commodity for a lot of years. Colgate actually had several distilleries in our area and had contracted with a lot of ranchers. And so we were continuing to try to figure out different ways to make peppermint production more efficient. And so my job one summer was to go out once a week and to collect plant height data from different areas that had been treated with different water regimes and fertilizers. And there were a couple of weeks that it was just hot and nasty, and I didn't walk the whole entire length of the field. And so I would collect data for about like the first 100 yards and then be like, okay, this is good enough, and go back to my car. And this is typical lazy teenageness, but it actually brings me a lot of shame and guilt today because this is my job now, and I did not have enough integrity to collect all of the data fully. And so it actually gives me anxiety to talk about this, but I wanted you guys to know that a lot of this ethical process can actually, you guys can learn from our mistakes and my mistakes specifically. And so we can see ethics show up in agriculture in a lot of different ways, and we're going to talk about those through the course of the semester as well. But for this class, I want you guys to just keep your bifocals on with your different filters and think about the ethics of everything, of every aspect of the scientific method that we actually will work through.